And so our speaker today is David Lambert. David Lambert is a global food security advisor to universities, the U.S. private sector, governments, the UN agencies, other international organizations. He formerly served as counselor to the U.S. mission to the UN hunger agencies in Rome. I might mention that prior to this diplomatic appointment, he was a senior vice president of the New York Stock Exchange. He directed all the public affairs programs in Washington. He also served earlier as a LA to Senator Fulbright. So he knows his way around this city. He's the kind of man we like to meet and greet, and we like to network with. That's why we're here in Washington. I work with a couple of nonprofits that have the same idea, the same ambition, but nowhere near the same success factors. But at any rate, we're so grateful for your willing to come and share with us. And you can tell us a little bit about your background with NPC and so forth. I'd appreciate if you could share that. Just come on up here.
Thank you, Paul.
And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And you know, it's great to be back here. I had 10 wonderful years of nothing but positive memories at National Presbyterian, back in the Louis days and in the Craig days. And I had the good fortune to serve on the NPS school board when Jenny McClory was the great chair of that school board. In fact, she appointed me chair of the safety committee, and some of my friends call the fence you see in front of NPS the Lambert fence and the Lambert light. So it's just great to be back here. It's a wonderful institution, and it means a lot to me. Paul's told me a little bit more about what you're about applying God's Word to God's world. And as I've reflected on that, I don't think there's anything more important than we can be doing. You know, paraphrasing Ephesians, I think, works are not the cause of our salvation. Works are the consequence of our salvation. We don't do all these good works to be saved. We do them because we have been saved. That's what we're all about as Christians. And you're trying to find answers in the world of people who need your help. And I tell my sons, every day you live on this earth, you can change someone else's life. They said, Dad, we're tired of that speech. So I bring them over here, and Craig Barnes is delivering one of his great sermons, and in the middle of it he stops and he says, if you don't remember anything else today, remember this. Every day you live on this earth, you can change someone else's life. They said, I guess you're happy. But I think that's a perfect lead-in to this topic of hunger and related issues. I'm going to go through these slides quickly. I teach a graduate course on global hunger at Catholic University, so any of these slides we could go for an hour. I would much rather listen than talk. I'd much rather learn than teach. And I have to say it's a little daunting to be in a room with Bruce McLaury with his command of global issues. I think I should sit down and let Bruce come up here. But anyway, I'd rather go through these and then let's have a conversation. Please stop me at any point. Comment, correct me, improve what I'm saying. Why should we care about the issue of hunger? I think the first two we can get through pretty fast. We know it's a profound moral issue. We don't have a higher commandment. As a matter of fact, Karen Armstrong says of all the major faiths in the world, there's no higher commandment than responding to hunger, poverty, and oppression. Tony Hall, who was Mr. Hunger, says there are 2,000 references in the Bible to those issues. Paul mentioned Isaiah 58. We know the bedrock is Matthew 25. But what else? It's a bipartisan commitment. It's not just a touchy-feely liberal issue. It's in 1984, Ethiopia was caving because of a very despotic government. And all of Ronald Reagan's advisors went to him and said, let them collapse. Let's show them the difference in a democratic society and a despotic society. and that will help what we're all about. Reagan said no. A hungry child knows no politics. This is bipartisan. We're going to save tens of thousands of children were saved by that decision. So it's on both sides of the aisle. Investment and trade, we need strong countries. If countries aren't viable, if Ethiopia is not viable, if Cambodia is not viable, they're not going to be buying our products. So that's, some of these things are, we know national security. 2008, commodity prices tripled in a matter of weeks. There were riots in 35 countries. One government was overthrown. So when this administration started Feed the Future, it wasn't just USAID and USDA. It was the CIA at the table, the National Security Council, the Department of Defense. They realized that food security is national security. Image in the world, 6 years ago, whenever, tsunami in Indonesia, world's largest Muslim country. The approval the month before that tsunami for Americans was 30%. Former Presidents Bush and Clinton went there. 1 out of 3 households in the United States pulled out a checkbook and wrote a check for the victims of the tsunami. The favorability rating of the United States in this large and influential country went from 30 to 70% in 2 months. That's huge when we need allies in every corner. So, we have a lot of hunger. You can see the numbers there. We don't see much of it. I'll talk about that a little later. This is in the district. This is in the United States. I might say on SNAP, people who've done the analyses on this, it's rather breathtaking that we don't have a better understanding of the return on investment for food stamps since it started. When it started, it was extremely controversial 60 years ago. Now, it's a bedrock part of our government, and it's supported by both sides, notwithstanding the debate on the Farm Bill. And the return on investment is phenomenal. Hungry people are in poverty. People who are in poverty are hungry. It's an interactive, vicious cycle. And the more you can do about hunger and poverty, the better your society is going to be and the better return there is on investment. 1 out of 7. You can see the numbers here. I don't need to go through all of them. I'll just pause for a moment. And please comment or at any point on any of this. Concepts. What factors are necessary for true food security? There's 6. If you don't have all 6, you're food insecure. Food must, let's take a local example. You could apply it to Zambia, but let's just take a person in Washington. Food must be available. Okay? We know it's available because we go to Trader Joe's and Whole Foods, it's there. It must be accessible. If she's shut in and infirmed, she doesn't have access to it. But if a neighbor says, I'll take you to buy food, then she has access. She gets to the food and prices have doubled because of shortages. She's on a budget. She can't buy it. She doesn't have. So it must be affordable. It also must be acceptable. If you buy nothing but organic and the food in the store is genetically modified food, you're not going to buy it. And it must be safe. If you want to get that chicken and it's full of salmonella, you can't buy it. You see that banana and it's black. It's not unsafe. It's just the quality is bad. So food must be available. It must be accessible. It must be affordable. It must be acceptable. It must be safe, and it must be of sufficient quality. Those are the factors for food security. 1,000 days. This is the pin I'm wearing. This is a global concept called scaling up nutrition. We are beginning to understand that if we don't deal with early child nutrition, all 8 development goals are severely compromised. What 1,000 days is simply a communications tool. From the moment of conception through a child's second birthday is exactly 1,000 days. If she does not get the iodine she needs for brain development, the vitamin A for vision, the iron for anemia, the zinc for diarrhea control. 5,600 children die every day from dirty water deaths, a child every 20 seconds because of unclean water. So, you know, we haven't understood. We're sort of like the movie Home Alone. What's the one thing in that movie everyone's seen? What's the one thing they forgot when they got on the plane? They remembered to do everything else. They forgot the child. That's the way our foreign aid has been, in a sense. We wonder, we spend hundreds of millions of dollars on really worthy projects. But if we have an entire nation like Ethiopia malnourished, they will never realize their dreams. And we can do everything we want to do on infrastructure and capacity building and technical assistance and all the other. It's going to be severely compromised if we don't deal with early child nutrition. The Lancet study is in. There's a huge amount of data on this. That if we don't get this right, the other is not going to work. So, hidden hunger. Hidden hunger has two distinctly different meanings, maybe even more. First hidden hunger is we would respond more to this issue of hunger if we saw it. We don't see it. We're going to drive home today and we're not going to see any of it. Most people who are hungry are out of sight. Why? They're fearful. They're afraid. They're afraid of arrest. They're afraid of deportation. They're afraid of being beaten up. They're afraid of being humiliated in front of their family and friends. You don't see them. And when you don't see them, you don't reach out to them. So that's one form of hidden hunger. There would be a greater political response, a greater response by churches and charities and NGOs if we knew more about it, if it were aware. The other form of hidden hunger I've already talked about, micronutrient deficiency. Most of the children in the world live on carbohydrate diets. You know, it's better to have rice than nothing. It's better to have maize than nothing. But if your diet doesn't have animal source protein, and if your diet doesn't have fruits or vegetables, you're going to be chronically malnourished all of your life. And you may live to be 25 or 35 or 45. But you will still have that form of hidden hunger. So we talk a lot about food security. We don't focus enough on nutrition security. Hunger, food security, malnutrition, how are they distinguishable? The media often uses the terms interchangeably. I do. Other people do. The UN occasionally does. Hunger is simply the sensation if you haven't had breakfast and you don't have lunch and you don't have dinner tonight, you're going to be hungry and you're going to have a headache and a stomach ache and things we know about. What's different about food insecurity is the psychological aspect of the uncertainty. If you are a mother with 2 children and you just had a good meal, but she doesn't have any resources, and she has this fear that her children will be hungry the next day, that's a tormenting psychological aspect. It's far worse than the physiological. So food insecurity has a quality of uncertainty. Malnutrition is just extended hunger in which your systems break down. And Taylor asked me, he said, "Dad, what's the difference in these?" And I don't want one of your long-winded answers. I said, what do you want? He said, "Just a short answer." I said, "Okay." I said, "If you're hungry, you need food. If you're food insecure, you need a psychologist." I said, "If you're malnourished, you need a medical doctor." He said, "Is that it?" I said, "Well, you wanted a short answer, so that's it." Malnutrition, most of this is about undernutrition. Most of the work the UN does, and USAID, is about undernutrition. There's another side of this two-sided coin called obesity. And in our society, obesity as a form of malnutrition is far deadlier, far more costly. $200 billion next year The children being born now will live a shorter lifespan than their parents for the first time in our society because of obesity. And we have all of these paradoxical federal policies that don't match each other. On one side of USDA, we have national nutrition goals for children. Across the hall, we have ag subsidy programs. They've never met each other, going in completely opposite directions. Ag sustainability, it's a very controversial concept. There's nothing more relevant today in the debate on food security. It's misunderstood. People engaged in farming and agriculture do not know who the winners and losers are. To some people, it means more cost of regulation. It has an economic and a social piece and an environmental piece. The concept is very simple. People try to make it complex. It simply means leave it better than you found it. Leave this planet better than you found it. You know, the work that Paul's doing on solar cooking is a classic example. How can we get energy and not put pressure on the planet and serve people at the same time? I mean, there are lots of strategies to deal with this.
Excuse me.
Yes, please.
Could you explain how it's controversial a little bit?
Sustainability is controversial because everybody involved in it thinks they believe it's going to be a cost to them. And it has many unintended consequences. Just one example. The Gates Foundation wants a more sustainable Africa. So they are supporting a variety of genetically modified maize, which will have yields 30% higher in drought conditions. Who could be against that? Activists are marching in front of Seattle because it's genetically modified. So these are the unintended consequences of sustainability, and it's controversial in a lot of respects because it has a different meaning. If you talk to conservationists, it means one thing. To some people, it means organic food. If it's not organic, it's not sustainable. And, you know, to some, it just means the safest food using the best science. Bill Gates' view is, here's my vision. My vision is an Africa in which there are no children who are hungry or sick. And I'm going to follow any science that's proven to get us there. Okay? That's unacceptable to some people. He thinks, in his view, that's sustainability. In the view of a lot of other people, that's a no-no. So it's a very hot button. Worldview versus scientific evidence. There are, let me come back to that. Demand pressures on the planet. We were 1.6 billion a century ago. We're now 7. So our population's going like, it's not going like this, it's going like this. Okay? And we're getting more affluent, particularly places like urban China, Brazil, Egypt. There's a lot more money in people's pockets. And when you have more money in your pocket, you're not going to have a rice diet. You're going to start buying meat, you know, and that puts more pressure on the planet. So these animal diets add additional pressure to the planet. If a child in Shanghai eats a pound of rice, pressure on the planet is simply a pound of rice, right? But if that child eats a pound of beef, the food conversion ratio is 9-to-1. Someone in Argentina or Canada has to grow 9 pounds of corn to produce that pound of beef. Okay? So animal diets are adding to the pressure. Biofuels. 50 years ago, for every 10 ears of corn that we produced in this country, we ate all 10 ears, either through animal feed or human food. Either corn on the cob or, you know, animal feed. Today, for every 10 ears of corn we drive our cars on 4. That, to say the least, is an extremely controversial issue, you know. So what science is doing now is looking for non-food sources for biofuels so it doesn't take pressure off the food supply. The supply pressure, I'll come to those later. I will say a word about food waste. Food loss and food waste, those are game changers. In this city, we have a lot of food waste. Not too much food lost. We waste it. We waste 25-30% of our food in our refrigerator and on our plates. That's not true in Mozambique. Most all of it is food loss because they don't have the technical ability. They don't know when to harvest. They don't have the transportation to get it to market. They don't have the refrigeration. So most of their food, 70% of all the bananas produced in Rwanda never reach the child. India, a country with 25% of the hunger in the world, one country. 43% of all child malnutrition is in one country, India. 40% of all tomatoes harvested in India never reach the child. This is food loss. So if we can come up through science, through new technologies of dealing with food loss and food waste, that's a real game changer.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
The waste in the U.S. or city,
Right.
is it from our homes or is it from the stores that doesn't get sold?
It's a combination. Stores are doing a lot more now through inventory controls and through computer technology and figuring out how much they're going to have and how much they need to produce and what they're going to do with their transportation. But there's a lot in both, and a lot of, as you know, a lot of stores gives a lot of food to charities. But when we take it home, Beth Keck at Walmart said, you know, my husband and I for years bought 5 bananas a week. And she said, I noticed that every week we only ate 3. And she said, that doesn't seem like a lot. That's 2 bananas a week. That's 100 bananas a year that some child could have had that we were just throwing in the wastebasket. So I think it's a good question. It's both. Yes?
I don't know very much about this stuff, but I would say that I would look at, say, the problem is, at first, is the tremendous growth in population in general.
Right.
And I guess my question then comes off of that. Are there signs that the human growth in population, in fact, does seem to be reversing in some places?
Does seem to be.
Reversing.
Right.
Which some countries are actually, Japan, for example, countries that have a very large overburden of older people and a comparatively small group of people who are young and are going to marry and produce children. There is some hope, I would think, there would be a demographic relief at some point where the total number of people on the planet is going to decrease. Is that realistic?
No, that's a great point, and let me get to that. You can see the numbers here. On population, there are 2 places on the planet that are losing population: Japan and Eastern Europe, because fertility rates are down and there's no migration in. Western Europe would be losing a significant amount of population but for migration from North Africa and Eastern Europe. China's at 1 point, a little over 1.3. It's going to be topping off because of their policies. India, because of discrimination against women and other social policies, at 1.2 is going to zoom to 1.7. But to your question, the best answer, which I have later in the slides, is educate girls. Educating girls, we don't have to get into religious ethics and concerns of conscience. Just stay within the bandwidth of agricultural development, nutrition, and education. There's a lot of data on this. When girls have the benefit of secondary education or more, they voluntarily have 3 children. Girls who are illiterate will have 6 children, and their children, those who are girls, will have 6 more. They will have far more diseases. They will die much earlier. They will be forced into riskier professions. They won't be able to keep a job or a mate. You know all the things that happen. So educating girls, this top demographer from Vienna spoke at AAAS about 2 years ago. And after an hour lecture, I went up to him. I said, could you reduce your lecture to 2 words? He said, what? I said, educate girls. He said, God, you're right. He said, that's it. That's it. So, we have, let's look at Ethiopia. Ethiopia's 10 million people, World War II. Now, 90. It's going to double. Okay? If they could educate girls, there's nothing, let me say this about international institutions. There's nothing that an international institution can do to rectify what a national government will not do. Because it all comes back to governance. When we look at the root causes, it all comes back to governance. That's nutrition policy. That's education policy. That's environmental policy. The things that improve society and lift people up. Those are all national governmental policies, and those go back directly to your question. That's how you deal in a substantial way. When you find when societies improve, their fertility rates voluntarily go down. And I'm not picking on Ethiopia or Nigeria is 160. It's going to be the size of the U.S. in 40 years. I'm not picking on these countries except to say from their standpoint, they're not sustainable. What they're doing for themselves is unsustainable. So that's why this is a very serious issue. We're now 3.5 billion rural. We've been a rural planet since the beginning of time. This decade, we're even. Urban-rural 50-50. By 2050, we're going to be 70% urban. Rural population is not going to go up 1 person. Urban population will go up about 3 billion. What does that mean from a policy standpoint? Where's the political power going to be? It's going to be in the cities. It's already in the cities, particularly in the developing world. Historically in this country, look at our farm bills. It's been in rural areas. But in Africa, it's in the cities. And the people in the cities are going to be in a stress situation on water. And they're going to want all the water. If the farmers don't get the water, there's not going to be any food. So it's a real climate change. Somewhat ironic that today there's a lot of polling that shows that those who deny climate change is on the rise. I go to the World Food Prize each year, and the top climatologists in the world come there and speak. 97% are of the same view on 3 things. It's real, it's here, its consequences are devastating. And IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, tells us that climate change is coming at us far more fiercely than any of the models. I mean, what we've seen with Sandy and Katrina, instead of having one of those every 5 or 10 years, if we have one every year, every 6 months. But rising sea levels, that doesn't bother us, but if you're growing rice in Louisiana or Bangladesh, you're out of business unless science can come up with saline-tolerant rice. Infectious diseases. The head of the Environmental Center at Harvard says that Lyme disease has gone up 10-fold in the state of Maine in the last decade. He says that is to a substantial degree because of climate change. That's one disease. Multiply that by the planet and what that means for pathogens that can reproduce in warmer weather. Lower crop yields. Food price volatility. Food price volatility, a lot of experts say is here to stay because food production volatility is here to stay. Why? Because of the extreme weather patterns brought about by climate change. Look at California. It hadn't rained forever, and now they get 10 inches in a week. So, but there's still, the deniers are on the rise. What about science, Paul? Bruce? I've covered some of this. Water scarcity is when the experts come to the World Food Prize, this is the issue they worry about more than any other issue. Because, you know, the availability of water determines directly the availability of food. You know, and also for us, you know, it's the staff of life. In many places in the world, it's a messenger of death because of unclean water and unsafe water. I've covered a number of these areas. Good governance, that's at the heart of all of it. If you don't have good governance, you can't overcome it with it. We've learned in our own society, look at what we've done as a nation that we've never looked back on, that we didn't have before, whether it's Medicare, whether it's Social Security, whether it's clean air, whether it's the National Park Service, whether it's the Food and Drug Administration, the Securities and Exchange Commission. You know, we've taken those steps in our narrative to get better governance. And there's a lot of fussing and fighting about it. But once we go there, we don't go back. Civil rights, fair housing, voting rights, you know, so governance isn't there, the rest is challenged. Ag research, and there are few things more tangible to deal with global food security than agricultural research, and it is severely underfunded. It just doesn't have the sex appeal. You know, it's and the work Paul's doing in solar cooking, I mentioned earlier. That's just a great example. You know, but at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, ARS, they don't get the funding they need. Improved seeds. Seeds are the delivery vehicle for food. And in most of Africa, their seeds are inadequate. They're not going to be able to produce the yields. They do not have the vigor. We need more research in that area. We need more science-based harmonization in seeds. Animal diseases. I've covered a lot of these issues. Investing in women. What's there to say that we don't already know, right? Women, almost half of the farmers in the world are women. In horticulture in South Asia, it's up to 80%. So do they get half of the technical assistance for agriculture? No, they get 5%. Can they vote in parliaments? Usually not. Can they own property? Can they sign contracts? You know, we've learned where women are involved in policy making in parliaments and legislatures, you get better policy products. You get more attention to children. You get more attention to nutrition, to education, to the most critical issues in our lives. And it's, as you know, it's cultural in a lot of places. And we do what we can to try to improve, but that's a key part of this entire equation. Post-harvest loss we talked about. Trade. Yes, please.
Comment on, as far as policy, the relative merits of direct aid of food being shipped versus money, and particularly like things about direct aid models I heard about recently, where people give money to, say, a poor person, and they buy food versus buying. People think they're going to buy, you know, spend it on liquor or something, and they buy food with it. So, you know, do we ship food over, or do we ship money?
You mean on foreign aid?
For hunger.
This is a good debate. For 50 years, we have a program where American farmers' products are sent overseas to the World Food Program and other agencies. So we ship commodities because our farmers are invested and it works politically and everybody's happy. This administration has a new proposal. It's not first is let's ship cash. Now, why would you ship cash instead of corn to Zambia? What's the argument? Well, the argument is that if we ship cash, we can get it to the beneficiary in a matter of a few days or weeks and not 3 months. The other is you can feed more children. And the other is you can save the government more money. So that's that argument. The argument against it is in a tight... Now, today you've got farmers invested in food aid. So in Iowa and Texas and Alabama and everywhere else, you've got the farmers supporting this. If you go to a cash basis, even with its merits, on a tight budget, you know, the budgeteers could zero that out quickly, and there's no political consequence here because the beneficiaries are overseas. So, very good question, and that's hotly debated right now on Capitol Hill with the Senate and House Ag Committees, and Raj Shah, who is head of USAID, and Tom Vilsack, who's head of USDA. So, I will yield to you for the best policy answer. I don't know. Yes, Bruce, please.
Well, I thought another consideration on that cash versus crop
Right.
is the effects upon the farmers in the recipient countries. That when we ship the crops, we are in effect disadvantaging the local production of food, whereas if we provide funding, we are potentially, at least along with technical assistance, helping them to produce and feed themselves.
Right.
I think that's been a big issue in this whole question of cash versus
Exactly.
crop.
That's a very good point. The criticism that the United States is interfering with local commercial markets and disadvantaging local farmers. Great point.
There's some also recent fascinating studies about these micro amounts of investment, so that you give $1,000 directly via like some sort of PayPal mechanism or something to a guy in Africa via cell phone payment. He uses that money to buy food for his family or something, put a roof over his head, versus the big aid agencies coming in and building infrastructure to provide aid. It's more of a direct method that helps the locals more efficiently.
Right. Good point. Thank you. Okay, biotechnology. This is not the answer to global hunger, but it's one of the policy tools. It's very controversial. It has a lot of different names. It's called GMOs. There are a lot of forms of biotechnology. The one that we're talking about here is genetically modified food. It's a hot topic. There's no evidence of harm to human health. Even the most strident critic, the European Commission, concedes that they've spent €300 million, 400 research projects over a decade. These are their conclusions. Zero harm to human health or the environment. So why does it stay so controversial? There's no evidence of harm. And what does it give us in return? It gives us better yields. Who could be against virus-resistant cassava in the Congo? Who could be against enhanced nutrition in rice, golden rice in the Philippines? It has to do with worldview, and it has to do with fear. Anything having to do with food has a lot of controversy. Almost all these issues are controversial. And there's a lot of fear connected with them. There's fear of genetically modified food. There's fear of industrial agriculture. There's fear of cloned animals. There's fear of irradiation. Fear of obesity. Someone asked me in Des Moines, why could somebody be against this if it's doing all these good things you mentioned? I said, well, there's a lot of money. If you can talk someone away from another product and toward your product, there are hundreds of millions of dollars in that. If you can scare somebody out of, whether it's a policy issue like Obamacare or whether it's food, if you can scare somebody away from point A to point B, somebody's making a lot of money. So there's a lot of economics involved in this. And then there's the worldview. Some people consider it unnatural. Foods have been modified for 10,000 years, but to some people it's playing with God's nature, and it's unnatural and it shouldn't happen. So there are a lot of different reasons that the controversy continues, and continue it does. That's just all in one slide. I would say we've talked about this in this, on enhancement to food production, good agricultural practices, agricultural productivity, and science-based regulations. These are the three reasons why Malthus was wrong after he was right. Malthus is still lurking. Malthus, you remember what he said, that, there's only so much land, so food production can rise gradually. However, human reproduction can go like this, and if these points get too far apart, there will be famine and death and collapse. And that's what he predicted 200 years ago. But we have now, on productivity, most of the commodities that we know have the yields have increased 5-fold in the last century. Corn and wheat, rice, 5-fold. We've learned a lot through our great land-grant universities, Auburn and Texas A&M and Iowa State and Cornell and all the rest. We've learned a lot about, how to farm and how to produce food and how to have better practices. Science-based regulation is key to a lot of it. So these are the areas that are keeping Malthus at bay. And we'll probably top out at 9 billion and start dropping a little bit. But there's plenty of food in the world. Nutritionists tell us we need about 2,100 calories a day. As Americans, we eat 2,800 a day. There's enough food in the world for every man, woman, and child to have 3,300 calories a day. So it's not a matter of food in the world. It's all the other constraints that I've mentioned. I guess that speaks for itself. So I would be delighted to.
Speaking of fear,
It's great to get together again. Not at 11 Wall Street.
Dave is one of the outstanding representatives of Wall Street when he was working for the stock exchange here in Washington.
Our leader.
And but you mentioned fear, Dave. What's going on in Syria, as horrific as it is, but isn't that a conscious technique by creating starvation over there? They're instilling fear, not only in Syria, but for political purposes, seem to have a huge impact beyond the number of people involved.
Absolutely. And this gets back to governance.
Yeah.
Whether it's Syria, that's right. Whether it's Syria, whether it's Zimbabwe, the lifespan in Zimbabwe is now about 35 years. 50 years ago, it was about 55 years. North Korea, the UN tells us that an 8-year-old child in North Korea is 7 inches shorter than an 8-year-old child in South Korea. The same anthropology and demographics for 10,000 years, and all of a sudden, because of a political line and quality of governance, and it gets back to Syria. And this, I would say, on Syria, puts enormous pressure on our contributions to the United Nations and what the World Food Program is doing there. The World Food Program they're feeding 1 million people, and it's really very stressful. And when governments don't cooperate, and they want to protect the workers who are there, and there are lots of NGOs, whether it's Presbyterians or Episcopalians or Catholics, or there are a lot of good work going on around the world. So anyway, good point. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Sure.
You said that right now enough food is produced for 3,300 calories per person in the world, so everyone can eat, if these other factors weren't present. And I remember when churches were very active with respect to food back in the 70s.
Right.
This was true. We were told this. So this has continued. But what I'm wondering, this is a kind of vague question, but I'm interested in what you think. Would you guess that at some point in the future, if other things don't happen, that the factors you're talking about, like population growth and climate change, would change that? I mean, is the picture so dire that we could well get to a point where there really isn't enough food for everyone in the world?
I would say if we don't have good governance, yes. I'm optimistic about it. I see a lot of good things happening in the world. I see better governance in a lot of places. I see big humanitarian hearts, and I see lots of people rescuing people who are hurting, what they do with their lives. And so I have a pretty good feeling about the future. But if we don't deal with these issues, and we don't adopt better science, and we don't improve our trade policies. World Bank did a study not long ago. They said, of the billion people who are hungry, 300 million could be pulled out of poverty by better trade practices. If we liberalize trade and bring down those barriers, So there are lots of policy answers that have to come into place, and a lot of environmental answers that have to come into place, and a lot of governance answers that have to come into place. So it's looking into a crystal ball and say, what will our children do when they're sitting in Congress, and sitting at the Brookings Institution, and sitting at the New York Stock Exchange, and sitting at the World Food Program in Rome? What's the next generation going to do? Are they going to have the sensitivity and the awareness to try to improve our lot? So I'm pretty positive about it.
I think Paul's first. Go ahead, Paul.
Oh, well,
Bruce, sorry.
No, I was thinking back to one of your earlier slides, David, on national security.
Right.
And former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates is one of the few Secretaries of Defense that I recall ever having made public speeches about the fact that the defense budget was, in some sense, he was focusing primarily on diplomatic relations, but
right.
non-defense expenditures were a more important part of American security than our national security. I thought, it was just very interesting to hear a Secretary of Defense say that. Food security is a part of that. I heard a month or so ago Tom Friedman in a talk about the Arab Spring, and he reminded me of us, the audience, of something that I'd forgotten. I think I knew at the time, but that the Tahrir Square in Cairo was set off as much, or perhaps even more, by food insecurity. That is, say, the rise in the price of bread in Egypt that had just taken off. I don't know whether it doubled or not. You have a much better grasp of the figures. But that was what people were rioting about. It was wonderful that there were other political and liberal institutional questions at stake, but it was first and foremost food.
Yeah, and would you not agree that Bob Gates' view is the enlightened view on the subject?
Absolutely.
People ask, does hunger cause terrorism? And again, I would yield to Bruce and others to answer that, but I don't think it's accurate to say hunger causes terrorism, but I do think you can say that hunger creates a breeding ground of instability, political instability, that can give rise to all sorts of things that it will destabilize a society. So, yeah, yes.
I think you're very optimistic in some ways. My basic look at the world stems from the fact that I spent 32 years in the CIA. And by the way, Bob Gates' memoirs shows what a really intelligent man can do for government. But I say, you seem to have this view of there's good government out there, and there is, but there's a lot of very bad government. And I can think of at least 3 cases, and you've cited 2 of them: Syria, North Korea, and I've forgotten the third.
Zimbabwe?
Zimbabwe, yes, where food and starvation have been used as a strategic tool for generations, millennia. And there's, China can say, look, you can have 1 child only. And if you start getting into this, what looks like the very human, charitable Christian thing of doing is providing for the poor and the starving, a lot of the world does not work on those principles. And I'd say, you look at the saying, you crash. I look at things like water. In the United States, California just got some snow, but they're out of water, and they've been out of water in real terms for a number of years. I would say in the long term, the entire extreme western part of the United States has simply got to...
Aid models, because obviously when people give money to, say, a poor person and they buy food versus buying, they think people sit there and buy, spend it on liquor or something. and they buy food with it. So, do we ship food over, or do we ship money?
You mean on foreign aid?
For hunger.
This is a good debate. For 50 years, we have a program where American farmers' products are sent overseas to the World Food Program and other agencies. So we ship commodities because our farmers are invested and it works politically and everybody's happy. This administration has a new proposal. It's not first, is let's ship cash. Now, why would you ship cash instead of corn to Zambia? What's the argument? Well, the argument is that if we ship cash, we can get it to the beneficiary in a matter of a few days or weeks and not 3 months. The other is you can feed more children. And the other is you can save the government more money. So that's that argument. The argument against it is in a tight... Now, today you've got farmers invested in food aid. So in Iowa and Texas and Alabama and everywhere else, you've got the farmers supporting this. If you go to a cash basis, even with its merits, and a tight budget, the budgeteers could zero that out quickly, and there's no political consequence here because the beneficiaries are overseas. So, very good question, and that's hotly debated right now on Capitol Hill with the Senate and House Ag Committees, and Raj Shah, who is head of USAID, and Tom Vilsack, who's head of USDA. So, I will yield to you for the best policy answer. I don't know. Yes, Bruce, please.
Well, I thought another consideration on that cash versus crop
right.
Is the effects upon the farmers in the recipient countries. That when we ship the crops, we are in effect disadvantaging the local production of food, whereas if we provide funding, we are potentially, at least along with technical assistance, helping them to produce and feed themselves.
Right.
And I think that's been a big issue in this whole question of cash versus
exactly.
crop.
That's a very good point. The criticism that the United States is interfering with local commercial markets and disadvantaging local farmers. Great point.
There's been some also recent fascinating studies about these micro amounts of investment, so that you give $1,000 directly via like some sort of PayPal mechanism or something to a guy in Africa via cell phone payment. He used that money to buy food for his family or something to put a roof over his head versus the big aid agents coming in and building infrastructure to provide aid. It's more of a direct method that helps the locals more efficiently.
Right. Good point. Thank you. Okay, biotechnology. This is not the answer to global hunger, but it's one of the policy tools. It's very controversial. It has a lot of different names. It's called GMOs. There are a lot of forms of biotechnology. The one that we're talking about here is genetically modified food. It's a hot topic. There's no evidence of harm to human health. Even the most strident critic, the European Commission, concedes that they've spent 300 million euro, 400 research projects over a decade. These are their conclusions. Zero harm to human health or the environment. So why does it stay so controversial? There's no evidence of harm. And what does it give us in return? It gives us better yields. Who could be against virus-resistant cassava in the Congo? Who could be against enhanced nutrition in rice, golden rice in the Philippines? It has to do with worldview, and it has to do with fear. Anything having to do with food has a lot of controversy. Almost all these issues are controversial. There's a lot of fear connected with them. There's fear of genetically modified food. There's fear of industrial agriculture. There's fear of cloned animals. There's fear of irradiation. Fear of obesity. Someone asked me in Des Moines, why could somebody be against this if it's doing all these good things you mentioned? I said, well, there's a lot of money. And if you can talk someone away from another product and toward your product, there are hundreds of millions of dollars in that. If you can scare somebody out of, whether it's a policy issue like Obamacare or whether it's food, if you can scare somebody away from point A to point B, somebody's making a lot of money. So there's a lot of economics involved in this. And then there's the worldview. Some people consider it unnatural. The foods have been modified for 10,000 years, but to some people it's playing with God's nature, and it's unnatural and it shouldn't happen. So there are a lot of different reasons that the controversy continues, and continue it does. That's just all in one slide. I would say on we've talked about this, and that's on enhancement to food production, good agricultural practices, agricultural productivity, and science-based regulations. These are the three reasons why Malthus was wrong after he was right. Malthus is still lurking. Malthus, you remember what he said, that there's only so much land, so food production can rise gradually. However, human reproduction can go like this, and if these points get too far apart, there will be famine and death and collapse. And that's what he predicted 200 years ago. But we have now, on productivity, most of the commodities that we know have the productivity, the yields have increased 5-fold in the last century. Corn and wheat, rice, 5-fold. We've learned a lot through our great land-grant universities, Auburn and Texas A&M and Iowa State and Cornell and all the rest. We've learned a lot about, how to farm and how to produce food and how to have better practices. Science-based regulation is key to a lot of it. So these are the areas that are keeping Malthus at bay. And we'll probably top out at 9 billion and start dropping a little bit. But there's plenty of food in the world. Nutritionists tell us we need about 2,100 calories a day. As Americans, we eat 2,800 a day. There's enough food in the world for every man, woman, and child to have 3,300 calories a day. So it's not a matter of food in the world. It's all the other constraints that I've mentioned. I guess that speaks for itself. So I would be delighted to.
Speaking of fear,
it's great to get together again. Not at 11 Wall Street.
Dave is one of the outstanding representatives of Wall Street when he was working for the stock exchange here in Washington.
Our leader.
And you mentioned fear, Dave. What's going on in Syria, as horrific as it is, but is that a conscious technique by creating starvation over there? They're instilling fear, not only in Syria, but for political purposes, seems to have a huge impact beyond the number of people involved.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this gets back to governance.
Yeah.
Whether it's Syria, that's right. Whether it's Syria, whether it's Zimbabwe, the lifespan in Zimbabwe is now about 35 years. 50 years ago, it was about 55 years. North Korea, the UN tells us that an 8-year-old child in North Korea is 7 inches shorter than an 8-year-old child in South Korea. The same anthropology and demographics for 10,000 years, and all of a sudden, because of a political line and quality of governance, and it gets back to Syria. And this, I would say, on Syria, it puts enormous pressure on our contributions to the United Nations and what the World Food Program is doing there. The World Food Program they're feeding 1 million people, and it's really very stressful. And when governments don't cooperate, and they want to protect the workers who are there, and there are lots of NGOs, whether it's Presbyterians or Episcopalians or Catholics, or there are a lot of good work going on around the world. So, anyway, good point. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Sure.
You said that right now enough food is produced for 3,300 calories per person in the world, so everyone can eat, if these other factors weren't present. And I remember when churches were very active with respect to food back in the 70s.
Right.
This was true. We were told this, so this has continued. But what I'm wondering, this is a kind of vague question, but I'm interested in what you think. Would you project, would you guess, that at some point in the future, if other things don't happen, that the factors you're talking about, like population growth and climate change, would change that? I mean, is the picture so dire that we could well get to a point where there really isn't enough food for everyone in the world?
I would say if we don't have good governance, yes. You know, I'm optimistic about it. I see a lot of good things happening in the world. And I see better governance in a lot of places. And I see big humanitarian hearts. And I see lots of people rescuing people who are hurting, you know, what they do with their lives. And so I have a pretty good feeling about the future. But if we don't deal with these issues and we don't adopt better science and we don't improve our trade policies, World Bank did a study not long ago. They said, you know, of the billion people who are hungry, 300 million could be pulled out of poverty by better trade practices. If we liberalize trade and bring down those barriers, you know. So there are lots of policy answers that have to come into place and a lot of environmental answers that have to come into place and a lot of governance answers that have to come into place. So it's looking into a crystal ball and say, what will our children do when they're sitting in Congress and sitting at the Brookings Institution and sitting at the New York Stock Exchange and sitting at the World Food Program in Rome? You know, what's the next generation going to do? Are they going to have the sensitivity and the awareness to try to improve our lot? So I'm pretty positive about it.
Go ahead, Paul was first. Go ahead, Paul.
Oh, well,
Bruce, sorry.
No, I was thinking back to one of your earlier slides, David, on national security.
Right.
And former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates is one of the few Secretaries of Defense that I recall ever having made public speeches about the fact that the defense budget was, in some sense, he was focusing primarily on diplomatic relations, but non-defense expenditures were a more important part of American security than our national security. I thought, I mean, it was just very interesting to hear a Secretary of Defense say that. Food security is a part of that. I heard a month or so ago Tom Friedman in a talk about the Arab Spring, and he reminded me of us, the audience, of something that I'd forgotten. I think I knew at the time, but that the Tahrir Square in Cairo was set off as much, or perhaps even more, by food insecurity. That is, say, the rise in the price of bread in Egypt that had just taken off. I don't know whether it's doubled or not. You have a much better grasp of the figures. But that was what people were rioting about. It was wonderful that there were other political and liberal institutional questions at stake, but it was first and foremost food.
Yeah, and would you not agree that Bob Gates' view is the enlightened view on the subject?
Absolutely.
You know, people ask, does hunger cause terrorism? And again, I would deal with Bruce and others to answer that, but I don't think it's accurate to say hunger causes terrorism, but I do think you can say that hunger creates a breeding ground of instability, of political instability, that can give rise to all sorts of things that it will destabilize a society. So, yes.
I think you're very optimistic in some ways. My basic look at the world stems from the fact that I spent 32 years in the CIA. By the way, Bob Gates' memoirs shows what a really intelligent man can do for government. But I say, you seem to have this view of there's good government out there, and there is, but there's a lot of very bad government. And I can think of at least 3 cases, and you've cited 2 of them: Syria, North Korea, and I've forgotten the third.
Zimbabwe?
Zimbabwe, yes, for food and starvation, have been used as a strategic tool for generations or millennia. And there's, China can say, look, you can have one child only. And if you start getting into this, what looks like the very human, charitable Christian thing of doing is providing for the poor and the starving, a lot of the world does not work on those principles. And I'd say, you look at this thing and you crash. I look at things like water in the United States. California just got some snow, but they're out of water, and they've been out of water in real terms for a number of years. I would say in the long term, the entire extreme western part of the United States has simply got to have a massive investment in either making water, which is prohibitive and technically very expensive, as the Saudis have found out. And so what's driving this thing is the only way of getting this thing under control is having fewer people around. Now, that is a very stark, radical thing to say. But how can we accept that? Can we accept it in a good middle-class way of agreeing to have smaller families, which is the European solution, and the Japanese? But you always have, at least in the world I know, you have the Syrias and you have the North Koreas very present and very active in the situation. That to me in the long term is probably the real problem. Another one is, how long can we depend on the fact that technology and more intelligent agriculture can really keep agricultural yields per acre ramping up? That is not, every technical thing I know about is what I follow are things like miles per gallon for a car. I would not, as a kid, involved, very excited about Cadillacs as a young person, could not have believed that Cadillacs would be sold that could produce 35 miles a gallon. But technically, what I do know, I'm pretty convinced, there is a limit at which technology can continue to increase the yield. You can only, using metal and ordinary stuff, you can only get so much increase in the yield over a period of time. And then the yields diminish and gain. And so I've enjoyed your talk very much, and I admired your very, what to me seems a very idealistic looking at the future. But I'm not.
And I appreciate your points, and I've learned a lot this morning from your observations and insights and comments. I don't pretend to have the answer on that very good question. And so your life experience informs me when I next meet with my students. So I thank you for that. Yeah.
Well, as far as better science goes in the future, I think it's noteworthy that two of this country's leading chemical companies, historically, Monsanto and DuPont, have in recent years shifted dramatically from their mission to agriculture, research in agriculture. Big time.
Right.
That makes me optimistic.
Yeah.
That's where the money is.
Well, of course.
It's enlightened.
Good.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. But
Good point.
Oh, I was just going to mention, I don't know if you've heard of Fred Pierce. He wrote a book recently called The Coming Population Crash. And he explains in this book that, as you said, Malthus is gone away because there is, generally around the world, including in Africa, there is a decline in birth rates everywhere. Now it's serious in
peak
Europe.
Child.
Yes.
Right.
But that's happening. That's a trend. But nevertheless, the fact is right now, for example, in Pakistan, the average woman has 7 children. Okay? And so this is where, as you say, you get a lot of these angry young men in a big crowd, and bad things can happen. You know, terrorism and so forth. But I'm thinking Egypt, where basically everybody's crowded along the banks of the Nile. They can't use the rest of the country because it's a desert, so they can't spread out. Everybody is concentrated in Cairo in this narrow strip of land. You know, so now it's 90 million people living on that little narrow strip of land. So no wonder there's going to be disparities and pressures. This is not long-term trends. This is stuff that's happening right now. And on top of that, isn't it true that in some places the local governments have policies encouraging higher birth rates? We had a speaker here talking about Israel, where some of the Israelis deliberately are having policies to breed more Jews so that they won't become a minority in their own country.
Right.
Things like that.
I think Russia's doing that too.
Yeah, trying to encourage higher birth rates.
In some countries, they encourage more birth rates because they assume that perhaps half the children or 2/3 of the children will die in the early years, and they want families.
Yeah.
And what you see is where there's been a rise in education, better governance, the children live, and they have fewer children.
Right.
Population, they live longer, so the population may go up a bit, but as far as the infant mortality, it goes down.
I just have an idea, if I may restate the pessimistic case.
Sure.
I'm a student of Egypt. I have a cousin who's teaching in one of the American school in Cairo. And you look at photographs of Cairo. When I visited once, that square was empty. Today it's full of people and buildings. You and I are paying $2 billion a year through the United States government to make sure that the peasants of Egypt have enough food. Egypt is right next door to what was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. So if I indulge me for a couple of seconds here,
sure.
That to understand the magnitude of what, if you're going to solve this problem without attacking the population problem, if we allow the population to continue to grow, you're dealing with something as large as trying to get the Sahara become the breadbasket of what was the Roman Empire. From history, I know this, that the bread that fed the mobs in Rome was basically grown in North Africa and brought up to the port there and distributed by the state as long as there was a state in Rome. And if we're really talking about, if we, without some kind of, I would say, some kind of voluntary sense, in the European sense of restricting the population growth, as the Europeans have done, it just seems an insoluble problem, because if you don't cut back in the size of the population, you don't have enough food now. This part of the world is dependent upon American taxpayers.
I think you will appreciate that since I teach at an institution called the Catholic University of America, I don't wade into that area. So I stay within the bandwidth of agricultural development, nutrition, and education. The points are well taken. But experts tell us today that if Sudan had good agricultural practices and good governance, it could feed all 53 countries in Africa. So, anyway, I just want to say that I admire so much this class that you have, and I really think this is what it's all about, because in our faith, we have to figure out, what are we going to do with it? What are we going to do tomorrow to change somebody's life? What are we going to do? And you're dealing with real-world issues that affect people. And I don't think there's anything more important that you can be doing with your time. So I'm here to applaud you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Just wonderful to be with you.
Thank you so much.